What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Floyd Street's Finest, presented by Great Flood Brewing Company. I am your host and friend, Jeff Greer. Welcome back. After a couple weeks off, I wanted to let things breathe a little bit after the season and see how things heat up a little bit with the coaching staff now that it has been completed. I did not plan this in accordance to the staff being, or at least the assistants being completed on Kenny Payne staff. I didn't plan it that way. It just so happened that the day that we were planning to reemerge as a podcast happened to be the same day that they announced their new coach. So we have Sean Vinsel, aka at Hoops Insight, on Twitter, on hoopsinsight.com, joining us today to discuss his work, looking at both Louisville and Kentucky from an analytics-driven and data-driven perspective. Obviously, we get into the weeds on Louisville players and what the roster looks like now, maybe some thoughts on the team from last year that could carry over. We also get into a discussion about which combinations work of the guys coming back. It's still a work in progress. We know that there's a lot to shake out still. I would imagine we'll know a lot more about this Louisville team in the next week or two as transfer decisions are made. There's some late recruiting decisions to be made, and certainly we'll see it all shake out. It's been really fascinating, a really fascinating start to the Kenny Payne era. I can't think of another time in my career. Now, I've been here 8.5 years. So just in Louisville alone, the thought of the Louisville coaching staff, and especially the head coach, figuring out a way to keep things from leaking out has been very impressive. I mean, you got to tip your cap as someone who spends a lot of time trying to find out things, and, has led to, some people are leery of me and some people aren't. That's okay. It's part of the job, the work. Wow. I mean, they have kept things under wraps really well. It took the rumor mill on Danny Manning around other coaching staffs around the country for it to bubble up to being, and that was the day of, for it to come out. And I will tell you right now, that was not a name that I had heard from anyone at any point over the course of these conversations about coaching staff. So I was just as surprised as I think a lot of people were with the news that was coming about. And obviously, I think it's a really good hire for your staff. You hire, as we talk about with Sean, one of the all-time greats in college basketball as a big man at Kansas, won a national title, but a guy who's also worked for Adidas schools. He was a head coach at Wake Forest, the interim head coach at Maryland. Obviously, things did not go well there. Things were okay at Wake Forest at times, but went south quickly. But tons of credibility and experience that matters. Even if it didn't go great, you've got a guy who at least can say, hey, this is what I learned from my experience as a head coach, and obviously has a ton of pedigree from the playing side as well as being an assistant coach in years past for some really good coaches. So fascinating staff that they've built out. You talk about a lot of recruiting reach, a lot of Nike connections, and certainly a staff that kind of covers over a couple different things. It's like putting together a roster. You want to make sure that you've got guys who dip into different buckets. It's not siloed into different things. It's guys who can touch on different elements. And you're talking about a guy in Josh Jameson who has a ton of experience from the administrative side, from the director of basketball operations position that he held at Oregon, a guy who was part of a really good program, went to the Final Four, obviously, et cetera, has been around that at a high level. Dana Altman's a really good coach. So certainly from that standpoint, a very impressive guy who can help you run a program. And then you toss in, I'm sorry, I'm scrolling through a little bit of the conversation about him when they announced things today. But you talk about a guy who's got all this different experience helping to run a program and experience hosting players, recruiting, et cetera, et cetera. And then you add in, we mentioned Danny Manning Obviously, we know what Kenny Payne's pedigree is. And then you, of course, have Nolan Smith, who gives you a little bit of the swag, a little bit of that young presence, the young juice, and a guy who obviously was a really good player at a high level as a guard. So when you mix all of that stuff together, NBA experience, I mean, there's a lot coming from a program you now have in Duke. I'm jumping all over the thoughts here. You now have a staff that were all assistants at Kentucky, Duke, Kansas, and Oregon. Those are among the biggest hitters. Obviously, Duke and Kentucky are at the top of the list, but even Oregon and and Kansas is up there too. But Oregon and Kansas, right there, I would say 4 of the top 6, 7, 8 recruiting programs in the country for a long time, with tight connections to Adidas and Nike, all on your staff. I mean, that is a big time recruiting staff that you've got built up at Louisville. So if nothing else, you need to get talent. So we'll see how the rest shakes out, but you would think that Louisville is going to be able to rapidly build a good roster. So fascinating few weeks now at Louisville. I'm fascinated to see if and where Justin Perez, who has the connection, of course, to Rock Nation, what his role is. It was reported by Rivals, UofL's Rivals site, Rivals UofL site, I should say, that it would be director of basketball operations. I've seen in a few places now that it actually might be a different type of role. I don't know. I don't have. I'm in the dark on this one. I found out about the Oregon connection about 40 minutes before the hire was made today, and it was announced today, and it was unclear who they were referring to. So it's kind of like, because there have been other names from the Oregon staff listed. So I'm just, okay, I don't know what to make of it. So I have no idea. I have no idea who else is going to be joining the staff, at least as of this recording. Maybe we'll find out more information as we go. But kudos and a credit to Kenny Payne and the staff at U of L for keeping things under wraps. It's a very difficult environment and place to do that. There's a lot of people around the program. It's a big program, and I'm fascinated that they've managed to keep things quiet. So, all right, that's enough of me. That is enough of me. Let's get you to this week's episode, where we will talk with Sean Vinsel, aka Hoops Insight. And before we do that, I want to tell you a little bit about our friends over at Great Flood Brewing Company. What a difference a few months can make. Come have a beer, bourbon, or glass of wine at Great Flood. Yeah, you heard me right. Beer, bourbon, or wine over at Great Flood. Of course, they've got their Middletown location right there on Shelbyville Road, as well as the Douglas Loop location at the bottom of Bardstown Road, at the bottom of the Highlands. As the weather warms, walk on up and enjoy our patio and friendly staff as we welcome what will be one of the most exciting off seasons to basketball and football at Louisville. And that football has had an interesting off season too, that's for sure. We are proud sponsors and can't wait to serve you. That message, of course, from our friends over at Great Flood Brewing Company. So make sure you go check them out. And now, without any further ado, here's my conversation with my friend Sean Vinsel. All right, we are joined now by Sean Vinsel, aka at Hoops Insight. And he is everything to everybody. He's a Mr. Data man. He is the analytics guy that I think Louisville fans and Kentucky fans both go to almost primarily at this point to look at the numbers and rotation info and all of the wonderful stuff to learn about the team from an analytical standpoint, a statistical standpoint, beyond what we hear about in our local media. So Sean, welcome to Floyd Street's Finest. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, I appreciate it. Long-time listener. It's a great show.
Wow, he's moving in from behind the curtain, turning around. That's very exciting, Sean. All right, so let's start here because we for full disclosure, Sean and I had coffee the other day, and he told me a little bit of his background. So for those of you who know what at Hoops Insight is and know what the site is, but want to know who this guy is? Let's let Sean answer that question. So Sean, I know you grew up in Louisville. I went to high school in Louisville. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up getting into the statistical analytical side of college basketball with these two teams here locally.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Like you said, grew up in Louisville. Kind of late 80s was when I really started paying a lot of attention to college basketball. So, Dwayne Morton, Jerome Harmon, Keith LeGree, those were some of the guys that kind of the first Louisville teams I really followed back then, and fell in love with the game at the time. And it's not hard to fall in love with basketball when you're in Louisville. And actually ended up going to Kentucky for undergrad, and they won the national title in '98, my freshman year there. So all of a sudden I've been around two of the all-time great programs, and through being around the state, developed a real appreciation for both programs. Went to a lot of games, saw a lot of interesting ups and downs for both of them. And then I was in actually grad school at Indiana, oddly enough. So another
wow,
top
I didn't
program.
know that.
Yeah, in 2009, I had a professor who worked with the Dallas Mavericks, and that kind of opened my eyes to doing data analysis on basketball. And after I graduated from grad school, one of the first things I thought was oh, I'd like to start doing this for college basketball. And obviously, Kentucky and Louisville have big, passionate fan bases. So I spent a few years kind of thinking what I'd like to do and seeing what I could track. I started tracking, lineup effectiveness, player on-off stats, and things like that, and started getting further into some of the advanced stats in basketball, which were more a thing in the NBA at the time than college basketball, but tried to translate that. And for about 4 years now, I've been writing newsletters, one for Louisville, one for Kentucky, just taking play-by-play data and kind of digging into stuff that you don't see every day. People don't usually talk about how different lineups performed or how players perform when they have different teammates. So I kind of wanted to dive into that and just see what I can find. And yeah, it's been really, really interesting. I think every year kind of brings me some new challenges, but I like looking at the games a little bit differently. And now, honestly, it's hard for me to watch teams except Louisville and Kentucky because I just know so much about them and I don't know as much about other teams. So kind of bores me, but it always keeps me interested. So it's good.
So when is the Indiana newsletter coming? When's the Indiana content coming then? If you've already got the other two of the triumvirate here, you might as well jump in full bore.
Yeah, honestly, the problem is my 2 years there were the first 2 years of the Tom Crean era when they won 16 games total over 2 years. Yeah. And so I never really got into Indiana basketball the way I did Louisville, Kentucky. So they're fine. If I ever expanded, they'd be a natural one. I've got a lot of friends who ask me about it. Yeah. Right. They'd handle the candle.
Well, let's so obviously this is a Louisville podcast, so we'll leave I know you get to do some hits over on the Kentucky side, the Lexington side, so obviously they will get their fill there, but we'll focus on Louisville here, obviously. Let's talk a little bit about last season, which is kind of a sentence that I think a lot of people will say, do we really have to? Obviously, January 24th, and I'll never forget that day because it was the day my son was born. And that was also the day that Louisville lost to Virginia and the rumblings of the buyout situation started to pick up. But from that date on, I think it's kind of fair to just say, outside of maybe individual performance and maybe how a couple lineup groups work together for guys who are returning, a lot of that data doesn't probably really matter in the long run just because of the situation. But I guess your general takeaways from the personnel that Louisville has coming back, and maybe what you might think their statistical path that they left from last season shows you about them.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's, first of all, a fair point. I mean, the last 10 games or so of the season, it wasn't good. I'll be honest, there wasn't a lot positive to take away from most of that, but I take that with a grain of salt because I don't think some of the negative habits that I saw in the data are likely to continue if you remove from the toxic environment. So, for example, 3 returning players, LLS, Jalen Withers, Sidney Curry, they all definitely had moments of individual offensive brilliance down the stretch, but some major issues when it comes to contributing to winning basketball. All of them had severe issues with not passing the ball very effectively. I think all of them had more turnovers than assists down the stretch. Ellis might have been close to positive there, but Curry and Withers had a really difficult time, for example, creating plays for others down the stretch. Well, okay, I mean, but you look at the environment there, that isn't the biggest surprise in the world. So I kind of give them a bit of a mulligan there, but I worry a little bit, if that continues this year, that's going to be a major problem. So like Louisville, for example, needs to bring in players who can really move the ball around, who can pass the ball. That was a weakness I thought going into last season. And I definitely saw that early in the season being a problem, and then it just got out of control late. But some things that I think were interesting that Louisville can definitely build on late. One of the crazy things they did was they were just shuffling the lineups, like everybody remembers. I mean, different starting lineups every game. So you couldn't really get a handle on how lineups were performing. But a couple players, obviously, who stood out in some moments. Ellis did a really nice job of getting to the basket, and Louisville as a team saw some of their offense improve when he was in the game because of that ability. He was really the one guy who could create that type of shot. So he obviously having him back is a big positive. And then, of course, I mean, Sidney Curry had some massive games. I think obviously he was really good scoring in the basket. I think his rebounding also was something that was a big positive for the team. So those are things that I think you can build on, guys showing those skills. On the flip side, I mean, Curry definitely had a lot of defensive issues. He had issues where the other team would score at the rim a lot because he was kind of out of position. Also, he fouled a ton, fouled and turned the ball over a ton. Those are I guess the best thing you can think about is with Kenny Payne coming in as a bit of a big man whisperer. Like those are problems that I guarantee you Kenny Payne saw, and he's going to work to fix. So I think,
and Danny Manning, don't forget about.
Oh yeah, that's true. I mean, you kind of forget they have an embarrassment now.
One of the greatest big men in college basketball history also happens to be on staff.
So I think of that. Like there's some others. I mean, so some of the other players returning, Wheeler, Trainer. I don't even really take a lot of what they did last year. I think it was kind of a fresh start. But the positive thing is, I mean, Louisville has a number of players who at least had some sort of pedigree coming in last year, and I wouldn't say they had any players who were returning who just were a complete flop last year. Like Trainer just didn't get time, and then when he did, I think he showed he can play. And I think it's the year prior he looked good. So there's definitely something to build on there. Worth remembering though, those are the returning players from a team that went 13-19. Like you're going to need to supplement a lot. That's probably the biggest worry I have so far is, and obviously some of it is other programs. There's whispers about who they're going after in the transfer portal. Louisville's a little bit quieter, so guys kind of pop up more out of nowhere. But Louisville needs to upgrade the backcourt pretty heavily. They need to get a true lead guard who can create. I'm a little bit less worried about some shooting because I think Lands, if Devin Ree ends up coming, he brings some shooting, but I think they need to add some complementary skill sets to what they've got right now. The good news is, I think there's a lot of players in the portal, so I mean,
as usual.
If you need to add 5 or 6 players, I mean, you can really do it nowadays, where a few years ago maybe you couldn't. So.
Yeah, and that's going to be fascinating because they got this May 1st deadline coming up. You have to think that there's going to be kind of some frenetic energy here over the next few days. But it's kind of the same problem that Louisville had coming into last year was into the offseason was they needed drink stirring guards, and they ended up with one in Ellis who still obviously needed to learn quite a bit. Of course, now his tweet gained so much traction after the coaching change where he said, don't get mixed up on last year. I'm a point guard, not a shooting guard. So maybe we'll see, some work there with Nolan Smith on becoming a better distributor of the ball. Like you said, Sean, we know that he's an excellent scorer, especially at getting to the rim and can get hot from 3 as well. But yeah, I think they need at least one more lead guard type guy. And I think they would benefit a lot from having a 2 guard who can step in and be sort of a secondary ball handler. I know we've talked about this over text and Twitter DMs with a couple friends of, you've got a guy like Mike James who was a highly rated recruit coming out of college, a top 100 kid, was considered a guy who could play the 2 or the 3, but he's coming off of a season ending significant Achilles injury. So we don't know what he can bring to the table. You bring in a guy like Devin Ree, but he's like a 6'7", really like a 3-and-D, like small forward type player for you. Kamari Lands is more of a 3/4. So they really don't have many true guard options on the roster right now. They don't. They just have El Ellis. Are there any guys in the portal who you look at who are kind of obvious fits for what we're talking about here, what Louisville needs?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like every day there's a little bit of a different answer to that, because it feels like every day there's an interesting player. I mean, probably the number one name that Louisville has been attached to recently they're going after is Tyrese Hunter from Iowa State. I think he'd be a really nice add. I'll tell you, he's not necessarily my favorite fit for Louisville right now, because of the fact that while he's a tremendous playmaker, I think he brings some really solid defensive skills. He is not an accomplished offensive player by any means. He last year really struggled shooting the ball from outside, struggled to get to the rim and finish, struggled to shoot from mid-range. He is not. I think like almost if you could combine Tyrese Hunter and El Ellis into one player, that player. Now, to be fair, that
we
player
had that issue last year too.
Yeah, that player's like an NBA, a top NBA guard. One name that I really am interested. Actually, well, 2 names. One jumped in the portal today. I'll leave with him. Is Malachi Smith, who's definitely a 2 guard. I mean, he brings some secondary playmaking skills, which, to be fair, last year that was my biggest issue coming into the year, is that Louisville didn't have secondary playmaking. They would have one playmaker usually on the court at a time. So having an off guard or even a small forward who can help make plays would be great. And Malachi Smith is Chattanooga. The guy is a proven offensive scorer. I mean, the guy
really good.
I mean, he can shoot from the outside. He can shoot from mid-range. He gets to the rim and he finishes there. Like, he does everything offensively you need from a guard. And that's really important, because I've been looking at the portal last year and this year a lot. And one of the things that stands out to me is, like, guards at the mid-major level, do they show that they can get to the rim and they can finish? Do they get 60% or more of their shots at the rim? That's not, it doesn't happen a lot. You get a lot of guys who are more, say, like a Jared West, who hit 55-ish% at the rim, which is solid. That's kind of passable, but doesn't show that if you've got a guy who really gets to the rim and hits shots there, that shows that maybe athletically they were at least a step above where they were and they can hang coming to the ACC. Another guy, I think probably my favorite player, and I hope he hasn't signed with anybody yet, Grant Sherfield from Nevada, is a very dynamic, not quite as good at finishing at the rim, but a tremendous playmaker in terms of very strong assist to turnover ratio, but can also contribute. Didn't have a great year shooting the ball last year, but great free throw shooter. So I think there's something there. He's the kind of guy that I think, like, he's maybe not quite as good as a playmaker as Hunter, and probably not as good of a defender, but much better offensive player. And I think given the lack of guards that Louisville has, you've got to find guys who bring more than just one skill to the table. I think they need more. That was one of the problems, for example, when they ran after Sean McNeil, is Sean McNeil's a very good shooter. That's all he does. That was the same problem last year with Noah Locke. He's a shooter, but that's really all he does. And so you can only put him in certain positions. And I think Louisville needs to find guys who can contribute in a number of ways. So those are probably the 2 guys that I would put at the top of my list right now in terms of, you get them, and all of a sudden Louisville's backcourt next season is absolutely one of the better ones in the ACC. So I'd love to see that, because, like you were mentioning, some of the other guys on the wing and I think in the front court, like, they have players there. So
there's a lot of talent. And Sherfield, is an interesting case because, Tyrese Hunter and Iowa State obviously ended up getting into the tournament and playing well and making a little run there. But Sherfield and Nevada, like, coming into the season, had very high hopes with that roster, what they thought they could do, and did not have a successful season by their standards at all, by most standards. And he was a big reason why, because he was coming off of an all-league type season the year before. They had a good backcourt, and it just didn't click for Steve Alford and his guys this past season. But he is a guy who has proven that he can play at a high level. I mean, Mountain West, Mountain West is as close of a non-power 6 league as you're going to get to be able to translate. I think it's one of like 2 or 3 at the A10. I would put in that conversation too, but that's a good league to have cut your teeth in before you go transfer to a power 6 league. I want to ask you this though. Like you said, there's a lot of talent or potential talent. Well, I should say there's a lot of talent and a lot of potential among the returning players. When you look at this roster, you add, I always mix up. It's so embarrassing. I'm just going to call him BHH because I always call him like Hunter Hayfield. I've screwed his name. I screwed it up on the radio today. So I'm just going to call him BHH. You add in possibly Devin Ree. You get Kamari Lands coming in as well. None of those guys are shorter than like 6'8". So all of a sudden, Louisville's roster, when you add in guys like Lands, who's probably a 3, Devin Ree, who could be a catch and shoot 2 or 3, Mike James is 6'5", 6'6". They are long. They are a big team. What type of impact does height and size have analytically on teams that you have found over the years?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think the key answer is it really depends on the coach's strategy for deploying it. But I would, I'm just going to guess here, and that's the problem is we don't really know quite how Kenny Payne is going to work things. Last year coming into the season, I felt like I had somewhat of a handle on what a good Chris Mack team would look like and where they could go, but Kenny Payne, not certain. However, if you look at maybe the teams he, under Calipari when he coached there, the height tends to be deployed in service of 2 things: offensive rebounding, and then generally, I'd say 2-point defense, the rim, and maybe even some mid-range stuff. I think offensive rebounding is a really interesting area because I'm guessing Louisville's going to end up playing probably 2 of Withers, BHH, Sidney Curry at the same time, maybe 2 of them at the same time a lot, which obviously is not going to have much shooting. None of those, I mean, Withers took a decent number of shots last year, but wasn't very good at hitting them. I think he's much better as a like a post-up guy or a roll man. And so are BHH and Curry. That's going to clog the lane a little bit, but it's going to leave the possibility for offensive rebounds. Well, what offensive rebounds do is they buy you a lot of forgiveness in terms of if you're not great at turning, if you're turning over the ball a lot, well, if you get a lot of offensive rebounds, that negates it. If your team doesn't shoot particularly well, doesn't have great shot selection, maybe offensive rebounding helps. It helps even a lot of that out. That for years, I mean, there's several coaches that live by offensive rebounding. Roy Williams at UNC lived by that for years and played 2 minutes and do that. So that seems to make the most sense to me because Payne coached under Calipari who did that. The other area obviously is defensively, and it's really more with front court and being able to contest shots. I think if you look at a guy like JJ Traynor, actually graded out very well at being able to contest jumpers as a freshman. He got plenty time. Curry probably doesn't fit that mold so much, but Withers and Huntley Hatfield probably can do some of that. And then you've mixed in Kamari Lands and Devin Ree who have length there. That helps a lot because that puts less pressure on your guards to need to contain the dribbler so much because they've got help defenders who have those long arms that can help with that. So I think those are 2 areas I think Louisville could absolutely use that length next season to help shore up some issues. But the biggest area I'm worried about is teams that are long, that have that length, sometimes don't do super well in transition. Sometimes they'll get some loose balls and they'll get steals and they'll score well. But overall, on the fast break, they don't do quite as well because they've got guys who aren't necessarily very creative with the ball, maybe have a little bit of a loose handle when they get it. Well, last year, unrelated matter, that was a huge weakness for Louisville. Louisville was a tremendously poor team at scoring in transition. And a lot of it was just shooting. They just missed a ton of shots there. But they didn't get to the basket well in transition, and when they did, they didn't finish well there. That's where I think some of the guards will help. Like I generally tend to prefer college teams that play, 2-3 guards with ball handlers who can kind of attack on the fast break because I think those easy baskets are really valuable. That's where I probably worry the most if you're starting maybe 2 guys up front and then somebody on the wing who don't have a very good handle, who don't attack the basket. all that well or aren't perimeter threats, the spacing on the fast break can be really hurt. So that's something I'd watch out for. And that hopefully, I mean, Ellis is the kind of guy though that can be a kind of a one-man fast break, and if you can add somebody with him who's kind of a more dynamic scorer, this is where I think Locke last year just struggled a little bit, is on the fast break. He could catch and shoot, but he couldn't really create and do a lot of things, and that obviously I mean teams kind of learned that, and that they just sink into the paint on the fast break on goal. It really hurt things. So that's what I'd probably watch out for the most.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I do think Kamari Lands is a dynamic scorer who will be able to do a lot of things for his position. I don't think he's going to be sizing up opposing point guards and trying to beat them off the dribble in transition, but I think for his position, he is just a guy who can score at every level and do it in a variety of ways. So he should be able to help there. But yeah, I agree. They need at least one more guy to kind of pull some strings and be able to have that breakout speed, because let's be honest. I mean, every season now for the last couple of years, the game has evolved to the point where you've got guys who not only shrink the court defensively and just make it really hard to score easy baskets, including in transition, but especially once they get in a half court, if they can slow you down in any way, shape, or form, it's really hard to get into the lane and score against teams like Baylor 2 years ago was a great example of that. But they also have some MFers out front who are super quick, athletic, who can finish in transition. They can pester you. And they also know that they can be super aggressive defensively because they've got the shot blocking and the gap filling behind them. So it was clear now for a couple seasons that is where the game has arrived, at least for now in college basketball. And so the length part of it is there. I mean, the length part and the gap filling and the shot altering, like you said, is there. It's just a matter of finding some more guys who can be aggressive out front and get you some easy buckets as well. Last thing then, Sean, I mean, we could talk about this for an hour and a half, but I'm trying to keep everybody's life in order here. We both have children that we have to worry about. I can hear mine through my headphones. I can hear him upstairs. So I know that I gotta get one more question in and get back upstairs. So I'm curious, as far as like tandems and pairings and guys who may have worked well together last year. And again, all with the caveat of basically toss it all out, like bad water or whatever phrasing you want to use. But were there any guys who you look at of the returning players who you're like, oh, that's kind of an interesting combination of guys who could work together? I know you mentioned Withers and Curry. Are there any of those guys who stick out to you from last season?
Well, that's kind of an unfortunate question, Jeff.
Oh, no.
Last year, there was one duo that really over the full season, and with a couple hiccups, mostly the full season, Louisville was really good when they were in, but unfortunately, neither of those players are on the team this year. And it was oddly enough Jared West and then Malik Williams, who certainly had a colorful year last year. The only other group that I found last year that was really notable and consistent was Ellis and Mason Faulkner, who is also not on the team this year. Mm-hmm. But the interesting thing is you did have some interesting sparks when Ellis and Withers played together. You saw some interesting things there. Mm-hmm. The one odd thing that I'm a little bit worried about, but I think some of it was just the toxic environment, is every returning Louisville player played worse when Sidney Curry was in the game last year. A lot of Curry wasn't a very good passer, so they weren't getting a lot of good shots. Most of them saw their usage decline, so that always hurts players a little bit. Sometimes they stand around, but also there's the confluence of Sidney Curry played a lot when the season was kind of going down the toilet. So sure. That's something I'm going to watch for early in the season. If Curry's getting a lot of playing time, is the team winning during those minutes, and then how are players kind of playing off of him? Because you'd think he could do a lot of things around the basket that might open things up for some shooting and things like that, or potentially he and Ellis might be an interesting pick and roll combination. So that's something I want to watch for. I'll give him a mulligan, but it's a little bit of a warning sign out there, like, hey, something was a little bit going on here where everybody wasn't quite at their best, maybe. So definitely watch for that.
Interesting. Well, yeah. I have to say, all we know right now is the staff, and they've got one addition, plus a recruit. So it's like,
Yeah.
there's a lot to be settled here. We should know more very soon, but there's a lot to be settled here. But just looking at three of the four assistants, with all due respect to the new addition today, Josh Jameson, I don't know a whole lot about him. But the other three guys, Danny Manning and Kenny Payne, especially for the bigs, potentially could be very helpful in defending pick and rolls. I know Kenny Payne talked a lot about Roosevelt Wheeler today and the work that he has to do from a development standpoint and like a basketball IQ, just growing into the college game. Sidney Curry, the coaching staff last year too, talked a lot about how he's still learning coverages. It's such a big step up from JUCO in high school to this level that you're learning a lot. But you have Danny Manning, you have Kenny Payne. You would think that those guys would be helpful. And then Nolan Smith teaching the guards how to play in those pick and roll situations as well. You would think that would be beneficial to them because of the experience level and the pedigree of the guys they've worked with. So we'll see. I think it's a fascinating start to this roster, but certainly still some missing pieces in this group.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, there's a lot of clay that can be molded. I think out of, the five bigs they have on the roster, at least one or two of them is really going to take to it. I think they'll definitely have some opportunities to fill in the backcourt with some transfers. Yeah, I think honestly, next year, let's consider Louisville a work in progress and building towards something. But I mean, let's put it this way. It's not going to be any worse than it was last year. It's going to be a whole lot better. It's going to be a whole lot more fun to watch. So that'll be great.
Yeah. There you go. That's a low bar to clear, but hopefully for the mental health of the Louisville fan base, they will be able to enjoy this coming season. I think they're already pretty excited about it. All right. Well, Sean, I appreciate your time as always. Give the people what they want. Where can they find all of your work online in different ways?
Sure. Yeah. My website's hoopsinside.com. You can subscribe to my newsletters there. I've got Louisville, Kentucky, and then I do an occasional one called Hoops Hindsight on past teams. I've also got a stats engine that you can link to there where you can see stats on Louisville's team last year, lineups. And then I'm on Twitter way too often at Hoops Insight there. So
stirring the pot on Twitter too often.
Yeah, if I've offended anybody today, I apologize. But if not, it's probably your turn tomorrow. So there we go.
There you go. All right. Well, Sean, thank you so much. I appreciate you joining us. I know people will find this to be insightful, and thank you so much for all the good work that you do. We'll be talking to you down the line.
Thanks. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.